Very few wars in human history come close to the level of viciousness that majorly characterized the First World War. This was one war that saw unprecedented levels of human casualties, as well as the use of some of the most inhumane war weapons, mostly in the form of poisonous gases. The devastating effects of these weapons would result in their outright ban during the Geneva Protocol of 1925. Today, on WarZone, we'll be unraveling some of the prominent weapons in World War I that became outrightly banned during the Second World War. On WarZone, we discuss all things war and bring you the most detailed and factual videos about every single war ever fought in human history. So make sure to like our videos and hit that subscribe button. Do leave a comment on this video, as we'd love to read your opinions about these deadly First World War weapons. The First World War is considered one of the bloodiest wars ever fought in human history, with casualties totaling over 20 million dead humans and an additional 21 million more wounded. The war featured the use of some of the most deadly and destructive weapons ever invented, most notably chlorine gas. In 1899, the world military powers came together to sign a pact at the Hague Convention. The pact was signed to effectively ban poisonous-laden projectiles that emitted asphyxiating and deadly gases. However, during World War I, the use of deadly gases was introduced into the battlefield between the Allies and their opposition. Both Allied and Central forces used noxious gases to attack and secure victories against themselves. On the 12th of April 1915, the Germans were able to deploy the first gas attack against the British forces in the Second Battle of Ibra, marking one of the deadliest and most horrific battles for the British troops ever. In the early hours of the battle, German forces were able to launch over 170 metric tons of deadly chlorine gas from over 5,700 cylinders buried across the battlefield. British officers who managed to survive the attacks described it as one of the most agonizing things to experience. Soldiers choked, suffocated, and had constant seizures in the most painful way possible. The British soldiers had no protective masks, as they never anticipated such a vicious attack from the Germans. Over 7,000 soldiers suffered severe injuries and over 1,000 died from asphyxiation, most of whom rushed to drink water, but only worsened the reaction of the deadly chemical in their body. Technically, the Germans didn't go against the pact of the Hague Convention, as the pact only banned the use of projectiles that were filled with poisonous gases. The Commander-in-Chief of the British forces vehemently described the attack as being very barbaric and inhumane. The British forces understood that Germany had gone through deep lengths to produce such deadly chemical weapons, and as the war progressed, the Germans would continue their chemical onslaught during ensuing battles, further depleting the British troops. As a form of defense, the British Army developed thick gauze pads that the soldiers strapped tightly over their mouths, but these gauzes proved to be highly ineffective and largely prevented soldiers from breathing well. The gauze proved to be completely useless against the chlorine gas the German forces continued to release into the air until proper gas masks called box respirators were invented by the British. It'd take a while before Britain was able to develop its chemical arsenal and deploy poisonous gases against the Germans. This was after the realization that since all was fair in war, they'd likewise need to invent a similar weapon to the Germans to better their chances at winning the war. A chemical factory was soon established in Porton Town to develop and furnish British troops with deadly chemicals for use at the war front. The British Army would attack Germany for the first time using poisonous gases at the Battle of Loos in September 25, 1915. Although the weather would greatly hamper the effectiveness of the gases released, it was still a remarkable moment for the British forces, who'd suffered greatly at the hands of the Germans. The British forces released deadly chlorine gas an hour before the infantry was going to attack, but the wind changed direction and sent back a deep fog of poisonous gas towards the British forces. From that moment, both parties heavily used chlorine gas as a war weapon until the First World War ended in 1918. While chlorine gas continued to be highly toxic, its effects were entirely neutralized with the mass production of gas masks that helped soldiers remain protected from the gas. By 1917, both forces had developed durable gas masks for their troops to enable them to breathe and function at high levels, even under the most toxic conditions. This breakthrough in protective gear would, however, encourage both sides to develop even more lethal and dangerous chemical weapons, like phosphine and mustard gas. Phosphine is a deadly irritant gas that's 6 times deadlier than chlorine gas. Unlike the chlorine gas that is visible given its bright yellow color, phosphine has no color, making it invisible. Phosphine is a slow killer and takes a longer time before its effects become visible. When inhaled, victims are not immediately aware that they've been exposed to the gas until much later, when it would have destroyed their lungs and suffocated them. The Germans were the first to use this deadly gas, but the Allied forces soon made it their signature chemical weapon. Mustard gas, like the other gases, had great destructive capabilities. Mustard gas is largely a form of vesicant that burns the skin upon contact. The potency of this gas was especially on another level. The gas was so dangerous that even if soldiers were to have their clothes and battle gear on, the mustard gas would seep into their clothes and skin and burn them through. It could even seep through heavy-soled boots. When the war reached a stalemate by 1918, the Allied forces were already using the deadly mustard gas as a last resort to break off the stalemate and penetrate German forces in Ibra. Adolf Hitler was reported to be one of the many German soldiers who suffered injuries such as temporary blindness from the chemical attacks. By the time World War I ended, it was estimated that over 6,000 British soldiers died from deadly gas attacks, which was only a fraction of the total World War I chemical deaths, which stood at over 90,000. However, over 40,000 Russian soldiers perished to deadly chemicals due to limited access to gas masks at the time. The soldiers weren't the only ones affected. Many nations suffered devastating losses of up to tens of millions of both military and civilian lives. Not long after the war had ended, a rapidly growing anti-war movement had risen to push for the control and abolishment of certain arms and weapons to foster greater diplomacy. This incident eventually made the League of Nations adopt the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which banned the use of chemical and biological agents during the war. Although this protocol banned the use of deadly chemical weapons, it did not stop nations from producing and storing these deadly weapons.